All right, so today I wanted to talk about one of your favorite subjects, low back pain, and all things low back pain. So we'll kind of get into your, history of it because I think it's an interesting history and a very interesting journey. And we've definitely alluded to it, I'm sure at certain points. But I kind of wanted to start off with just a brief like overview informationally just about lumbar spine stuff because there's a lot of confusion, and we can get into the McGill stuff and the confusion around that and how grossly misinterpreted a lot of Stu's work is and everything. Um, but in terms of just, lumbar spine stuff, I find that, from well, just to start, I think from an informational standpoint, it's useful to think about the spine as kind of the core of the body. That's kind of what Tom sees as the core. He doesn't see the core as like the abs and the erectors and those kinds of things. Like the spine itself is kind of the core and the conduit through which every, force transfers from, lower to upper, upper to lower body. And the lumbar spine is, the most, we'll say, structurally stable, structurally supported in and of itself of all the different portions of the spine. So as you move up in terms of the regions of the spine, from lumbar to thoracic to cervical, you kind of move away from what you can view as structural support, structural stability, and you move a little bit more toward the mobile end, where most of your rotation kind of comes from, the rib cage and upward, the neck, where you kind of need to be more mobile. And then, as you sort of move down toward the pelvis, you need a little bit more stable of a structure, one that isn't really meant to rotate and kind of bend as much, but one that's super, super good in sort of, stacking itself on itself and dealing with heavy amounts of load that sort of come from everything above it, and so on. And so I think that when we talk about, the lumbar spine from like an anatomical perspective, I kind of look at it as like the I think it tends to be so problematic for people as just like a, hey, have you experienced low back pain thing? Because so much force has to go through the lumbar spine, almost more than any other segment in the body, any other section in the body, just because of where it's located. And when we talk about low back pain specifically, I think a lot of people start to bring the conversation to things like disc herniation and disc health and those kinds of buzzwords. And I think that, a lot of that stuff can kind of get people lost in terms of actually navigating their issues from a practical perspective. I've seen a lot of people sort of become their diagnosis of like, oh, I have this disc bulge, right? When in reality, something like a disc bulge is as common as, having some kind of like shoulder labral tear, at some point later in life. So a lot of different little informational bits to kind of touch on here throughout the conversation, but I kind of wanted to just introduce a little bit of the basics of like, okay, when we're talking about the lumbar spine, we're talking about the part of the spine that is the sort of thickest, strongest, least mobile of all the different parts of the spine. And for the reason that, there's obviously lots of force that needs to go through it and needs to be sort of translated from upper to lower and vice versa. And so with that kind of framework established, I think what can get confusing for people in terms of just furthering their understanding of the lumbar spine is the differentiation between how it moves and then how the rest of the spine moves. So I mentioned that as you move up the chain, you move toward a little bit more mobility, but I would say the primary joint actions that are present in the lower parts of the spine are flexion and extension, right? So you can think of that as like arching your back and like rounding your back. That's where like a lot of that stuff can come from, at least in terms of total motion. The lumbar spine in a sort of natural, we'll call it neutral position, is technically in a slightly arched position, and it never really goes past a straight position, but it does extend further back toward a greater degree of arch. So, when people bench press, for example, and they get this big arch in their back, most of that arch is actually coming from the low back, as opposed to the upper parts of the spine, where the upper parts of the spine, again, the thoracic spine specifically is actually a sort of reverse curve of the lumbar spine, where it actually, technically speaking, is kyphotic, meaning that it from the backside, it's a little bit more rounded out, right, to sort of serve the backside of the rib cage in its shape and, all the air stuff that needs to go through there. So just from again, from a function perspective, lumbar spine is mainly like this flexion extension deal, but I think it's a noteworthy point to make that when we are talking about training the spine, training the surrounding muscles of the spine, that movement isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, because I think in lifting, the culture around lumbar spine health is mostly, I'll say, looked at as like, because the lumbar spine is more stable and it's meant to be more stable, we should only train it like isometrically. We should never train it through flexion and extension. And I think that it's worth noting just early on in this conversation that, I don't think either of us would probably subscribe to the opinion that you shouldn't move your lumbar spine or train it, or that you should only do motions, that involve actually something dynamic versus something, like a plank. So just kind of brief introduction, a lot of random points there, but just some bits of information for people maybe who hadn't heard anything about the lumbar spine, the lower spine, to start off. So where I kind of wanted to take this was just, you've obviously had a history of low back pain. I've also had a history of low back pain. I went through a pretty severe bout of it later on in college and a little bit afterward, which we can talk about. But I kind of want to start with where that began for you, not necessarily just in terms of timeline, but in terms of first signs that you sort of noticed low back pain, because I know, if I recall correctly, it was quite some time ago. And only really recently have you really seemed to have dialed things in, from a training perspective, and it seems like you've had some really good outcomes insofar as managing that. So take us back to the kind of beginning of when that stuff sort of started from you, and in maybe what context it started.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't remember the first time that I had lower back pain. I feel like, all throughout playing sports and then, getting into lifting, like, you have various injuries. Like in some ways that's, just the nature of the beast.
Mm-hmm.
But I can remember when like the frequency of like debilitating back pain, started increasing, where, the kind of back pain where it's very difficult to just get around, dress yourself, those kind of things.
Yeah.
There would be incidents where, not necessarily during like a heavy lift, although, sometimes that could occur, but more often just like, reaching for something, during the day or in the gym or whatever, and, just getting sort of like a shooting pain. And then, the body sort of going into a very just like locked position, and, maybe anywhere from like a few days to a couple weeks of, having a really difficult time just getting getting about the day and kind of like, basic activities of daily living. And I think the frequency of those just kind of like picked up over the years. And, of course I was doing lots of physical therapy, lots of massage therapy. So, all different types of manual work, ranging from things that were more like, muscle activation related, quote unquote, to things that were just, very heavy, deep tissue work, like say, active release therapy, those type things. And went through, various forms of continued education. Again, kind of in the physical therapy world of, Gray Cook's FMS and SFMA, to the sort of Prague school of thought with dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, to learning from people like Bill Hartman and obviously, Pat Davidson, and spending a lot of time like the PRI methodology. And, just kind of skipping ahead a little bit, and then I'll circle back. I think, one of the big things for me is there wasn't a lot of direct carryover to what I was actually doing in the gym, and, how to modify that. And it seems, sort of reflecting back, that there was a lot of just like, treating the symptoms, a lot of just like dealing with the aftermath and trying to sort of like, buttress against potential problems happening, but there wasn't a lot of, really dealing with the root of how these things were happening in the first place, in terms of what behaviors was I doing both in the gym and out of the gym, versus like what are the exercises that are going to, you know, make me bulletproof and more functional. So anyway, kind of like going through, you know, 10 plus years off and on, you know, of those acute flare-ups. You know, around the time you and I started training together, even a little bit before that, you know, I was going into prep for the Amateur Olympia, and, you know, things got really bad around that time. I don't know if it was before or after that. There was one period where it got so bad, I ended up in the hospital, and they gave me, you know, basically every painkiller known to man, and, you know, doses that were the highest doses they could give me for my body weight. Did absolutely nothing. I just remember it taking like, I don't know, what felt like an hour to get into the car. Like I just couldn't, you know, contort my body to get into the car. So we like set the seat all the way back, and I'm laying, you know, diagonal across the car, and just all sorts of experiences where it's like you just find yourself you know, not able to get to the bathroom, and just very basic things that you take for granted just every day. And you get, you know, you can get really, really good at just like pushing that pain aside. And, you know, I had similar stuff with gut issues, you know, during that period as well. So you can get really, really good at just like pushing through stuff. But, you know, eventually it kind of reached an impasse with that. And that was, you know, post contest when I started gaining weight again after the Amateur Olympia. And, you know, we were training together, and I couldn't, you know, change my own weight. So you were moving the, you know, the weight pin, like literally not like the 45s, but just like the weight pin.
Yeah.
You know, and just kind of like this, you know, clearly something needs to change here. So, you know, the story I always tell is we were, you know, doing our ritualistic, you know, pre-workout walk, and you had said, you know, who do you think of first when it comes to low back pain? And I said, you know, of course, kind of the first name in this field is Stuart McGill. I mean, he's, you know, published seemingly the most research and has the most direct experience working with people, you know, who look and behave like me. So, you know, set about getting in contact with him, and that's really where, you know, everything changed.
Yeah. So let's run through then, you know, from the standpoint, because I think that there's a lot of people who probably get low back pain like whilst lifting. You know, it's like they're doing a leg press or they're doing a deadlift. So your major problems really came from activities of daily living more so than like the actual lifting itself. You know, so like obviously at a certain point it was overlapping, but you were kind of willing to deal with the discomfort if it ever came up during a training session. Like it was always kind of more tolerable in the moment, and then just basically when it started to kind of erode, you know, taking a shit or getting into the car, that's kind of when you started to take action. Is that correct?
I mean, I can remember acute flare ups where it was like, oh, I was squatting and, you know, something fell off. And then, you know, by the time the adrenaline sort of wore off, you know, it was difficult, you know, to walk,
Yeah.
you know, deadlifting, et cetera. And over the years, I went from, you know, eventually took out deadlifts, you know, back squats were already out of the equation because I had, you know, surgery on both shoulders. And one of those surgeries really limits my shoulder external rotation. So I, you know, couldn't
Yeah.
back away. But yeah, I mean, I had flare ups that were both pretty obviously related, you know, to a particular lift, and then things that would just like seemingly come out of nowhere. But I
Mhm.
want to point out, like, I hear very often, and, you know, because if I'm watching a YouTube video, like more often than not, it's something related to training. So my bias is that, you know, I'm listening to lifters, you know, more than most, but just speaking specifically to that crowd, you'll very often hear them say like, well, what I was doing in the gym like wasn't wrong, or they're sort of defending their training style, and they say like, I never got hurt in the gym. You know, like when I tore my quad, I was, you know, walking down the stairs. You know, like when I hurt my back, I was, and I hear that, you know, I woke up and, you know, blew out XYZ. And I think that story is a little skewed in terms of just not understanding, chronic stress and sort of the tipping point of, it's like the straw that broke the camel's back kind of a
Mhm,
deal. So I
mhm.
think far too often people talk about, oh, I slept on it wrong, or, I've never gotten hurt in the gym. Like clearly this wasn't a gym thing. And I think far too often people overlook the fact that these are, things that build up over time, and where you were when it occurred is not necessarily like the sole cause of why it happened.
Yeah, so you know how I sent you a picture of those noodles the other day with the fiber in them, which I
Mhm.
didn't know as fiber, and you identified it. For context, the listener, my brother had sent me a picture asking about this like soy noodle, which if you could like 2 pounds of the noodles were like 120 calories, something ridiculous, something ridiculously low. So of course, when I see that, I'm like, there's a trade-off here. What is it? Like, I'm going to ask Ethan, and you mentioned that there's like a lot of fiber in there, and um my brother he's a big like chat GPT guy. So he was talking to chat GPT about fiber and stuff. And to the point of like thresholds, I think this is a good analogy where you can, if you're not used to eating a specific amount of fiber, like you may eat something that has a proportionately large amount of fiber in it. And the first time you eat it, it may be totally fine. Right. But then, maybe start to eat it every single day. And eventually you get to that point where it's like you get close to that threshold and then you sort of back off, and then you get a little bit closer and I back off. And every time you move a little bit closer to the threshold of having a massive diarrhea incident, and then the one time that you cross that threshold, it's like, oh, I've been eating these noodles for 7 days in a row and nothing bad has happened, but now all of a sudden you seem to have sort of overflowed the glass, if you will. So I think that's a good maybe analogy to articulate that. I also think that one of the things in sort of a more weightlifting specific context that may help people understand this is if you are doing an exercise and the exercise is painful in some way that you don't want it to be painful, like the bad kind of pain, and you lower the weight and you do more reps and it feels better, you did not fix the issue. You just moved it below a certain level of perception. Like all the forces are probably still the same in terms of the actual, whether it's compression or shear or whatever combination. So that's another good example where people will be like, oh, and to the point about like watching YouTube videos of people lifting, they're like, oh man, this skull crusher really fucks up my elbows. Like, let's just do lightweight, really slow and controlled. And that's another good example of you're just moving it below the threshold of perception. So so that's a really good point. In terms of lifting, I wanted to cover something that was a specific, maybe, because it's very difficult to say. I got a lot of messages that are like, I have low back pain when I'm doing, leg press. Can you help? And oftentimes in that context, I'll just say, sure, like send me a video and I can like try to recommend something quickly. But it's basically just a guess for the most part. It's a very complex thing to kind of, because there are so many moving parts. You're not just doing one single exercise. The exercise that you're doing that you experience pain on may just be the thing that is making it manifest, and it may be actually problematic somewhere else. So I think as a general rule, because this kind of has to be a more generalized thing, if you don't have someone in front of you that you're working with, is whenever you're doing an exercise to train a joint. So let's say you're doing something that's hip and knee related, try to just move those joints. Because a lot of times what happens is this conversation goes toward like, is butt wink bad? Is butt wink good? And I think a better way to look at it is like, if you're doing a squat and you're having butt wink and you don't have any sort of pain, that doesn't mean that it's not a problem, like kind of like we just discussed, right? But it also doesn't mean that it's, you're going to explode. Clearly, you're able to do the thing to some significant degree, right? But I think it's more helpful to look at it from the standpoint of just the mechanics in terms of like what you're actually trying to train. Like, are you trying to train, flexion and extension of your lumbar spine, or are you trying to load your hips and are you trying to load your knees? So I think that's maybe a better framework. Is if you're doing a squat, the reason I tell people to try to avoid butt wink is because I'm trying to train the legs. I'm not trying to train, the spine, at least most directly with this activity. And so if I'm going to do something that's for the spine, you can do a lot of flexion extension stuff with the spine, especially at like, just like, even just body weight on like a hyperextension, just getting people to be able to feel like what actually moving their spine is like. And that's a situation weirdly where like people don't tend to have that same discomfort that they might have had, in something like a back squat going through the flexion extension stuff. So it's more to me like the spine health stuff in very, again, generalized terms with a lot of just the average lifting population comes down to, is the activity that you're trying to do one where you're intentionally trying to move your spine? Because if you're trying to keep your spine still and it's moving, there's going to be a lot of conflicting things going on there in terms of the forces on the actual, facet joints in this case, that may end up being problematic. So for me in particular, it's like, I'm going to try to keep my spine as rigid as I can if the output goal is that hip and the knee, and then I'm going to allow it to move, and I'm going to intentionally make it move if that's the goal. So it's more just like, what's the goal, match the motion with the goal kind of a thing. Any comments on that?
Yeah, it seems like one of the things that people use as a marker for a successful, for a good exercise is, can go one of two ways. Like one, people will really champion, oh, I don't need to use as much weight on this exercise because I'm going through more, of a full range of motion.
Mhm.
And the other end, which I think probably more often than, well, it could go either way. So I'll just state it first, which is that the other direction might be like, well, this exercise is better because I put myself in a more stable position and now I can move more load. But there's also a lot of ways you could achieve that outcome of, more weight on the bar that may also, not be the quote unquote optimal way to go about it. But just examining the first one of, I'm, you know, I'm potentially like increasing, the orthopedic safety of this exercise, or the, we'll say like the improving the stimulus to fatigue of this exercise simply because I'm using less load.
Yeah.
And look, I think I've certainly set out to do that in certain ways before, whether it be like exercise order or rep range, things like, BFR. There are absolutely times where the goal is, to use the least amount of weight on the bar as possible to, achieve the desired outcome. But I think what happens sometimes is by moving, in a segment that we want to be stable in order to get, the highest possible output. When we move at that segment, yes, we get more overall motion. Like we'll probably get more knee flexion, in the appearance of hip flexion, like if we're going through more lumbar motion. And that will probably also reduce, output, either through, yes, potentially just like traveling more distance, but even more likely just that you don't have, what we're calling like an anchor, to be able to produce force. And like you said, if the spine is the quote unquote core, the center of this organism, then that may be something that we want to be relatively stable if we want a, strong foundation to be able to, produce force upon.
Yeah, and I think a good example to that, and I think you're probably picturing this as you were saying, it is like a leg press. So, a lot of people, if they're just on a typical 45-degree leg press, if they actively were to pull their hip without moving their spine just off of the platform, a lot of times it moves a very short, again, like external distance, right? The joint is going through its full potential range in that and within those constraints, but you will get to a point where the foot plate will continue to move only if your, we'll say your tailbone and your lumbar spine start to come off of the back pad, which to your point is kind of like, again, losing that degree of anchorage, which is, I think that's a really important point to bring up, because I think there's a time and a place for, lighter weights and controlling it if it makes sense, contextually. Like if it were like, I'm just not controlling this load and I need to kind of hoe it in on tempo, but everything else is kind of locked in, that's definitely one scenario. And then another being, the opposite of that. So
I think, sometimes the argument is like, well, why not just, go through the fullest amount of, distance or, range of motion possible. And if other joints move, who cares? We're just training more, total muscle.
Yep.
And I think what gets lost there is that, part of the reason why the output is going down is because you don't really have much stability, to be able to produce, distal or, force output at the limbs. So in this case, with the leg press, we're talking about, hips and knees, but it could be, even something, like an upper body exercise as well. Uh, in this case, like we have a back pad behind us, and that might maybe form part of the, the anchor for the leg press here. Could be a chest pad, for a row. But championing this idea of, well, I need to use, half as many plates on the leg press because look at how far, I'm traveling, with this foot plate. I think, really misses this idea that, like, yes, you probably will work your spinal erectors, a little bit more to get out of that position, but you will also probably lose output elsewhere. And even though the appearance of failure, will happen at the legs, like you will see your legs shake, you will feel them burn, that part of that sensation can actually be, furthered, it can be created just by a loss in stability, and that the two look very similar. Like
Mhm.
fatigue from, not having a good anchor looks the same as, for the most part, as fatigue, from being able to grind through a rep, and they both feel very exhausting.
Yeah. And I think it can be, the leg press in particular, or something like a hack squat, can be very misleading because you do have so much leeway in terms of what can look visually similar, because you do have a ton of contact on something like a back pad, but it becomes exponentially more obvious with something like a leg curl or a chest supported row, where it's like, just take the leg curl pad off of your femurs and just see how much you can curl that way. It's kind of like a much more exaggerated, magnified version of what we're, I think, trying to get at here. The example I gave some of this example the other day where I had them try to like do a chest supported, like they did a chest supported row with whatever 200 pounds visually on the stack, and then I just moved the chest pad away from them, and like they couldn't even start to initiate the pull out of the strongest theoretical position. So and not that to the question of the conversation of range of motion, it's kind of like range, the question I always ask is like, range of motion for what? Is it range of motion for a muscle? Is it range of motion for a joint? Is it range of motion for a specific exercise? Is it range of motion for a specific resistance profile within that exercise? Because all those things make the mobility we see change and keep the concept of mobility kind of in flux. So yeah, so those are, I think, some good points to touch on in terms of now, back to your specific experience with the low back stuff. So how do obviously your situation is kind of this N of 1 situation where you had these specific prescriptions. You went through this process with Stu where, I was there with you when we did the assessment, and you kind of slowly managed to work your way back. But to me, it seemed like, a lot of the changes that you made were very specific changes to the way that you were doing daily activities, especially, and then also just the importance, or the degree to which you paid attention to things like set up in something like a leg press, or set up in something like a leg extension, making sure that you had all those things in check. So let's start with the daily living scenario stuff, because the exercise specific stuff can get very precise to the specific leg press or implement. So just in terms of the daily living, kind of like, what were the bigger rocks that you focused on? I know you did some additional walking and things like that, or maybe less walking, I forget. So yeah, to talk to us a little bit about some of the changes you made, at least initially.
Yeah, I mean, the first change was just kind of a washout period of like, let's just take, at least a couple weeks off of training altogether. Let's just like, get out of the weight room. And in the meantime, we're going to focus on these activities of daily living, or what Stu calls spine hygiene. Um, So, I mean, that literally starts, from the time you're in bed, to the time you go to sleep. And eventually, like any other behavior, it becomes more and more, subconscious over time. So, for my, like, specifically what I had going on back pain wise, which is very similar to, what you would see in a bodybuilder or power lifter. I think kind of like the most common case is, had a bunch of disc bulges. One happened to be, pressing on the sciatic nerve, so I'd feel that in the typical place, like, through the glute, down through the toes. So I had some shooting sciatic pain. I also had end plate fracture, which is basically like a compression fracture, above the disc, like of the vertebrae, just basically the part that sits on top of the disc. And let's see what else is going on. It's disc bulge, end plate fractures, and then also what he calls like spinal instability or shear instability, which is basically like little micro movements causing sharp pains. So people can usually identify these through conversation. When you're like, do you ever roll over in bed and get, a shooting pain? When you go to say, like, bend over and pick up a towel, and then, you're out of commission for a few days. It's these, like, again, these micro movements that you don't pick up on an MRI, but you would see on a moving x-ray or an x-ray fluoroscopy, where there's just a little catch, and then all of a sudden that catch turns into like this very painful locked position that usually lasts something like a day or a few days. And ultimately, like, it has sort of lasting repercussions for weeks on your training. But yeah, so it was basically like engineering out these micro movements, allowing enough rest for the tissue and bone as well, like to be able to heal in regard to the fractures. And with the disc bulge, more than anything, that's like a postural change. And by postural, not just static, like how I'm standing, but how I go about my day. I mean, you notice even every time I do the podcast, I'm sitting, in this gamer chair, right? So the gamer chair, has the lumbar support. It's got a very solid, bottom underneath. I can adjust the height. So, I'm sitting in kind of a man spread position here, position that I might squat out of,
Naturally.
abducted, externally rotated, femurs. And have the chair height set that I'm short of my maximum hip flexion, and then I'm sitting back against this lumbar support as well. And the idea being that just essentially the positions that you stay in all day long cause what's called tissue creep, or basically just like a short-term adaptation. Like any other adaptation, it's going to be geared towards survival and being able to maximize efficient use of energy. So it's just one of these things, just like use it or lose it. When you do it often, your body is going to adapt to it, and try to find the most efficient ways to sort of maintain those postures. So basically, if you're going into positions all day long where you're rounding your spine, or you're allowing those micro movements to happen, that if you're a person who's going to put yourself under heavy loads, that may not necessarily be the type of adaptation that you want to be able to tolerate high compressive loads. So it's ultimately like genetically, what type of person am I? Pretty thick boned, larger person, more like a linebacker than like a gymnast or a golfer. And that has certain implications as far as disc shape, certain implications as far as the orientation and the size of the facets. So there are genetic considerations. Then on top of that, behavioral considerations in terms of like what I've decided to do with my life and what, the needs are, as an athlete to be able to, survive those loads. And then, marrying essentially my activities of daily living with, the type of, spine that I want to create and what I want it to be resilient to. So some of the, activities of daily living, let's say some of the most common ones are, putting on shoes. A lot of people will sit down, flex their spine, stay there for a little bit as they're tying their shoes. He teaches basically putting your foot up on a bench and then doing a very vertical trunk, very knee dominant, sort of like dorsiflexion position to go into putting your shoes. So it's a very upright lunge position, doesn't allow for much rounding of the spine. Recommends a lumbar pad. They use ones that have a little pump, so you can basically adjust the the thickness of the pad. And you'll find, that the morning thickness and the night thickness and the thickness, 20 minutes after you set it are not all the same.
Mhm.
So it's always kind of adjusting for that, in the morning, there's going to be a little bit more, there's going to be, significantly more fluid in the disc, which kind of gets squeezed out throughout the day. And that'll influence, the amount of tolerance, that your spine has to bending at that time during the day. And also how much support you may want behind your spine if you're sitting. And again, the reason why I explained sort of the, etiology of my back pain first was because, not everyone is going to have the same recommendations, but in regards to, a lifter who is, intolerant to flexion. So I got pain with flexion. I also got pain with extension, also got pain with compression, but basically just um, there was really no position that I had, I think I'd kind of exhausted, all directions there. But it's very common, for a lifter, for example, to have a posterior disc bulge, which is thought to be brought on by flexing, repeated flexion under high compressive loads. So in those cases, that person may want to find ways throughout the day to round their lumbar spine less. That can be how you're putting on your shoes, for example. That can also be just like how you bend over to pick something up. So I'm picking up dog toys, when I come back at the end of the day, just looking over at this guy sleeping on the couch right now. And when I go over to pick those up, either I'm, getting into a hip hinge position or more of a single leg deadlift where I might hold something for balance and then, kick one leg back as I go into sort of a dodo bird position. Some people call it lift. But yeah, all throughout the day, you'll see me in those postures. If I'm brushing my teeth, I might be in a hip hinge, when I go to spit. If if I'm in bed, and I go to roll over, I'm not twisting my trunk or my hips first, I'm rolling as one segment. And, some of the exercises in the beginning are just, standing on one leg, learning to, create more stiffness, in the trunk and not allow for bending. It might be doing twisting like motions where you're stopping yourself from twisting through the spine, but instead keeping, the hips and the pelvis sort of more, or sorry, the pelvis and then the rib cage sort of more locked together as you rotate. And just relearning basically how to minimize motion at the spine, especially for this period of, intolerance. And, by allowing myself more rest time, these activities of daily living are all in Stu's books. I think the one for the lay public, I'll think of the name later. I know he's got low back disorders, which is sort of the clinician's book. He's got ultimate back fitness and performance, which is sort of the strength coach book, and then he's got one for the lay person as well. I don't know, Ben, if you remember the
Is it called Back Mechanic?
Yeah. It's sitting right next to me, actually. Yeah, Back Mechanic.
I Googled it.
But yeah,
Wasn't off the dome.
I think like Back Mechanic is a really good one to just, uh, pick up some, pictures and just like be able to flip through easily and see, what those activities of daily living are. But it also starts with like a self-assessment, again, because, everyone's not getting the same prescription. Low back pain isn't one thing, just like leg pain isn't one thing. You could have, anything ranging from like a harpoon sticking out of your leg, to, a fractured femur to, XYZ, right? So back pain is not one thing. Pain, can come, especially when we're talking about athletes that have very, very different demands. The reasons for the pain can be varied as well. But yeah, so took time off, spine hygiene or activities of daily living. And then on top of that, just continued to modify both exercise selection and setup, as well as just the layout of my week and of my training cycles, and just allowing, for more rest in between training days, I think has been, huge.
Yeah, so I think a couple of the major themes there, and to kind of take it back to like what we could call like first principles of this stuff, I guess, is it's not that, because I, like you said, it needs to be contextualized. It's obviously not that if you have, the same even feeling of pain that you had, that the solution may be, the same or anything like that. But the way I kind of look at it is like, what are the specific kinds of stresses that you are, encountering a lot of, and what kinds of stresses may you need to sort of eliminate in order to deal with those, or what other kinds of stresses can you sort of introduce as a means of gaining some degree of variability, like in your training. So for example, in your specific case, it was almost like you had gone so far to the end of that spectrum that you kind of needed this like sort of blank slate situation where you slowly then started to reintroduce the things that were comfortable. But a lot of people may kind of be in more of a middle ground type place where, they might not need to just eliminate all the things that are potentially stressful, but maybe just, create some degree of a trade-off. So, some examples, or the first one that comes to mind with me specifically was like, I used to do a lot of barbell squatting when I was, super into powerlifting. And at the time, the most magical thing to me was like doing a lot of the PRI shit. For two reasons. One is just like I was spending more time doing something else that was not the super stressful activity of back squatting. And I was also, with certain, kinds of those exercises, introducing just different forces, right? A lot of the stuff in PRI is more flexion based than extension based. And so, powerlifters oftentimes feel like the PRI stuff is this magic pill because they've never trained their abs like in a, or their serratus in a way that was to any degree meaningful. So I think part of it can be eliminating what may be already present in excess, and then some of it can just simply be, in some cases it can be like, what are the sorts of trade-offs that I can make to just simply decrease stress in this one bucket and maybe fill it in another to a degree that's not beyond a threshold of a problem, at least not initially. But I think one of the hardest things for people who really take lifting seriously is just taking that, like having the balls to take that step back, because that's actually something that a lot of the time you have talked about as being something that's become more important for you over time, is just being able to identify when you're sort of starting to approach that line and getting better at identifying the sensations and the kinds of feelings that come with that fatigue before it sort of is too late. And I think that's a lot of the game with this type of stuff. Of course, there are all these like specifics that we can get into, and Stu has probably some really, really good in the back mechanic, I haven't read it, but I'm assuming that it's a very practically applicable book. Like he probably gives a lot of good recommendations for people broadly. But also to me, it's like the more I'll give a specific anecdote recently is like sometimes when I feel like I start to accumulate, more high degrees of stress, and that could be training related, but could also just be, life related, emotionally related, whatever. I feel like I start to have these lights on the dashboard come up, which are almost always the same in terms of like where they appear on my body. So for me, it's always been like left low back and left upper back. It's like those are just the two spots that tend to start to like speak to me a little bit. And last week in particular, that was happening earlier on in the week. And so what I did was I just took like 2 extra rest days, and that was something that was able to dissipate. Where, I think a previous version of myself would be like, oh, what is the mechanical thing that's happening here? How can I add something to fix it? What am I missing that I need to add? Rather than just being comfortable being like, let me just take a step back and like see if this is just a global thing that kind of needs to just calm down. And a lot of times for me, especially recently, it has been. So I think there's no one way to do it, and all those things kind of can come together and work in tandem as well. But I think a great starting place for a lot of people ends up, especially people that take lifting super seriously, ends up being like, let me just kind of try to reassess what is sort of present in my training bucket, rather than just seeing what kind of shit that I can, add on top of it. And on a slightly separate note, a lot of people see a lot of physical therapists for this kind of stuff, like this kind of chronic low back pain stuff. And, they'll get specific remedies, like just these remedial drills. Maybe it's like, this drill works on glute activation. This drill works on core stability. This drill works on, adductor recruitment. And I think all those things at the minimum can have these like transiently good effects. Like, they make us sort of lose a sense of some of those bad sensations, and they introduce novelty in a way that is helpful. But a lot of the times you kind of see that as like a short-term solution to this more chronic issue. And so it's not that physical therapy is bad, or that it doesn't help, or that it can't help, because it absolutely, can change people's lives. But at the same time, in the population that I specifically have worked with over time, I do find that there is this over reliance on these kinds of remedial things. And I've just seen time and time again in clients and in myself, that stuff ends up, working for whatever amount of time. And maybe that's, part of the function of it is just getting someone out of a little bit of a hole. Maybe they're closer to competition. It's kind of something they need to plug in there. But I think for most people, those kinds of things end up being these, again, short-term solutions that address symptoms rather than root causes, which are inevitably, impossible to identify to any super specific degree. So did you have anything on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, kind of going back to my, history with, all sorts of manual therapy, chiropractic, physical therapy, and not like just the typical, person's, sort of dipping their toes in with that stuff. I mean, as we went to school for exercise physiology, like I've traveled the country studying, under very high level people. So I'm not going to your physical therapist like around the corner for insurance.
Yeah.
Charging, $200, $300, $500, an hour. They're close friends of mine. And in a lot of ways, like, I think, I've learned so much from that. Probably at some point will find myself circling back around and finding ways that like, I don't even know about now, to sort of reintroduce maybe components of that. I can say that since doing the rehab with Stu in, it must have been
Year and a half
ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to, some type of physical therapy and manual therapy, usually like twice a week, maybe do one manual therapy session, one physical therapy, like at least once a week, cranial sacral therapy, you name it.
Mhm.
I have not done a session of any of those type of modalities like in the last year and a half at all. And yes, there's some credit to Stu with the low back stuff, but I think more than anything, it's just been like a philosophical change. Things kind of came together at the right time between you and Tom and Stu. The mindset of just like, you know, understand, and also I don't know that I've mentioned before on this podcast, like my work with somatic therapy or sort of like self-regulation with Seth Oberst, but Seth was, you know, a big part of what we were talking about here of just sort of identifying, you know, sensations, behaviors, you know, patterns when you're fatigued. I think all of that just like coalescing and, you know, coming into this big picture of just how to manage fatigue, how to manage training, and, you know, what you mentioned before of not necessarily looking for something additional to add on, something that like needs, you know, something that's missing, that is just that little link that's going to make me invincible. It's understanding that like you have physical limits, and like you can't just keep adding things to just, you know, go forever. You have to understand this natural, you know, wave-like function of coming up, coming down. um you know, whether that be weight gain, whether that be training volume, whether that be food volume, you just respect the fact that like you are, you know, a living organism. And even if it wasn't, even if you were a machine, machines still need, you know, breaks, still need time off. And just having more respect for that process versus thinking that, you know, you're smart enough or anyone's smart enough to sort of, you know, overcome that and just find the next, you know, missing link. um so, you know, rather than breaking something, going to physical therapy and asking what's the solution, if something is, you know, feeling off, it's identifying what the problem is rather than looking for an additional thing. You know, the assumption that like, oh, you're doing everything right, you're just missing, you know, this other thing. It's more of the assumption of, well, either it's just been enough time and stress that, you know, it's time to back off, or maybe that there's something we could be doing a little bit better rather than something new to add on, you know, has been huge. So I think those are kind of the big things that, you know, again, you say this is specifically geared towards our population, you know, of lifters, people training for, you know, strength and physique sports. You know, we're not necessarily talking about like, you know, again, mentioned to you before we got on the call watching this like quarterbacks documentary. It's not about like Mahomes who has a high ankle sprain and needs to go play next week. You know,
Yeah.
it's like guys who are most, you know, guys and girls who are mostly, you know, doing it to themselves, you know, in the weight room. It's not a general population person, you know, who maybe has extremely low fitness, you know, in any level, you know, of activity, you know, or any kind of like novel sensation, you know, may be enough to keep them sustained for a very long time. But, you know, our specific population, I think two things that I saw not get addressed very well that I've done differently in the last, you know, couple years or so. One has been, again, just to reiterate that concept of like when you're going in for treatment, that you're looking for something additional that needs to be done and something that you're lacking versus having a conversation, having a thorough investigation of what you're currently doing, and maybe looking at how you could be doing that better. And
Yeah.
that's not something I saw enough of. And I also think like as a person, you know, who's always looking for that next thing, always wanting to be a little bit better, we tend to go sort of sometimes outside of our field where it's like, okay, now, you know, I'm doing all this stuff within bodybuilding, powerlifting, whatever. Now I'm going to seek out this physical therapist who does not train like I do, who doesn't treat people like me, and thinking that like, well, they're so smart, they're gonna have the answers that no one within my field has the answers for.
Mhm.
And it's like these dumb, you know, bodybuilders and powerlifters, you know, they don't, you know how to treat this stuff. I'm gonna have to go to like the gurus, you know, who have, you know, the secret exercises, and they're gonna know, you know, what I'm missing. I think there's probably a lot of missed wisdom in maybe some of the people who have, done in the sport for a long time. In powerlifting, for example, like, I know Stu's friends with some of the great, strong men, and powerlifters, and he has learned a lot, working and teaching, you know, with guys like that. So there's a lot of wisdom in people who have, done it successfully a long time, observing, what they do. And obviously, like, there's some luck involved with that, but also just understanding, you know, those adaptation cycles and sort of when it's time to back off. So that's one of, looking within your sport, looking within, the specificity of what you do to do that a little bit better, whether that be like changing the exercises or the setup, whether that be allowing for more rest, whether that be, changing things like, volume, effort, intensity, what have you, to sort of find the right dosage so that you're not crossing that tipping point. And then number two would be incorporating it into your daily life. So the rest of your day, I right now I take 3 walks a day that are, at least 15 minutes each, very fast-paced walks. That's a recommendation that Stu has. The thought process there is by like swinging your arms, and maintaining a sort of slight brace as you walk, that's adding a little bit of stiffness for those people who have, sensitivity to micro movements, which is, a lot of people basically over time who have bared a lot of compressive force, have gotten some disc bulges, and over time just flatten out those discs. So they lose a little bit of, what he calls turgor, or basically just ability to maintain position. Those walks are also good because I'm doing them out in nature. I'm always, in the woods or in a park where I'm doing it. So I'm getting sunshine, getting, natural elements. I'm doing it with my dog or a friend a lot of the time. I'm eating all day long, so it's coming before or after a meal. All those things, separately, you can talk to people from probably just covered 4 different fields there that would all tell you like taking a brisk walk outside is a good idea. And again, just like, are you sitting all day? Could you be, taking short breaks in between sitting to stand up and change your posture? Like, how are you putting on clothes, tying shoes, picking things off the floor? Like, that's a big chunk of your day. And, if you're someone who treats this as a professional, it's worth, examining the rest of your day. What's your bed like? What are your shoes like? Those type of things.
Yeah, and I think sticking with the sort of 30,000-foot view perspective there, also just paying attention to what else is going on in your life outside the context of training. When you're only looking at training in this vacuum, it can be very limiting in terms of your ability to navigate these things. Even just things like a change in environment, travel, as you have discussed with me often, is something that can be very fatiguing if you're someone who's in a very regimented routine, someone who likes to sort of be stable in the same environment, going to bed every night at the same time, waking up every morning at the same time. Like, even just those small changes to a circumstance, anticipation of an event, or sort of recovery from an event, may be factors. Like, I mentioned briefly that I had this like long bout of low back pain happen. Like, that happened during like the meat of the pandemic, and I didn't think to I was only looking at like, what are the mechanical influences of this back thing, rather than like, oh, I literally haven't seen anyone but my parents and my brother for several months, and I'm lifting in my basement alone, type of thing. And it was not so coincidental, I think, that when I started to when things started to kind of clear up, and that was initially when I was like started to go into hype, like low back stuff, got better over time. And obviously there are tons of influences to that, but I think that's just to speak to the broader point of, as the person who is like closest to the biomechanics thing, I have certainly learned the hard way that you need to pay attention to a lot more than just what the X's and O's of the forces you're interacting with are. Not that those can't be major influences, but they are just a sort of piece of the puzzle and not the whole deal. And you mentioned powerlifting. You see that reflected in powerlifting to a large degree. Like so many of the most advanced, like heavyweight guys, especially that are squatting, 1,000 plus. It's like they're squatting once every 2 or 3 weeks, in like the peak of their off season. And I think that's just again one of those magnified representations of like them recognizing like the fact that per every unit stimulus they provide, they have this sort of equivalent amount of fatigue, and that the more advanced that you get, the more fatigue you can generate. And so rest just becomes more and more I think relevant. And at the end of the day too, at a certain point in competition, you gotta kind of eat certain things, like if you're a month out from the New York Pro, certain things will change. But again, I think for most people, most of the time, those are kind of the big toggles, the big levers to pull. Anything that you feel like we missed on this topic overall that was worth mentioning, maybe other than the fact that just broadly speaking, I think like Stu's work, we've talked a lot about Stu, like his work is generally in my experience misrepresented. People call him like the pig spine guy. He's the guy that like says don't move your spine or else it's going to shatter. And that was obviously not your experience in communicating with him. He was a lot more nuanced than the average person who has just heard his name thrown around might think. And so I think to Stu's credit, he is a very experienced professional who's worked with tons of different kinds of people, the most professional athletes that you could probably work with. So this is a guy just, so people can sort of understand who he actually is, that is incredibly, no pun intended, but like flexible and compliant with whoever he's working with and whoever happens to be, in front of him. So, and anyone who hears anything about, Stu in a negative light, come talk to Ethan, come talk to Ethan.
But yeah, I mean, in regards to that, look, they had, an in vitro lab, which is what you're talking about with the pig spines. Like any other field, of study, you're going to start with the most controlled environment possible. And that's where you're going to start to form some hypotheses, for the in vivo and for the treatment of, real people.
Yeah.
So, they have a lab where in order to create reproducible, results and have the least amount of confounding variables, like you can get, 100 pig spines that are nearly identical. And, they're young, like healthy spines. Try getting, 100 like teenage, human spines that are identical. Not gonna happen.
Yeah.
But then, you also have an in vivo lab, right? Where they're, I don't know what the ratio of studies was from like, in vitro looking at just very specific mechanisms to then, testing those mechanisms in people, and then also looking at things sort of like epidemiologically or just like they were very often like consultants for big companies who, say it's like a factory where they're putting on car bumpers or something, and they're looking at the incidence of low back pain in those workers. To sports organizations. I know one year they worked, I believe, with the Cardinals, and they had, the MLB team, but then they had the 5 also minor league teams underneath it. They were able to predict low back pain like with 100% accuracy over, X amount of years. They said, we think these 5 people are going to have low back pain, and they did. So, and then moving on to the clinic, they also had, a clinic at the university where they saw real people, and he continues to see real people to this day. And most of the people that he's seen, I think within the last, say, 10 years or so, because he's been retired for maybe 7, 8, are really just like your highest level performers. I mean, I was lucky to know someone, that knew him. So, I wouldn't put myself in that category, but, your pro UFC, your UFC fighters to, presidents of countries and, NFL, linemen to Olympic athletes, that type of demographic mainly makes up, I think, who he's seen in the last decade. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up in regards to kind of where I'm at these days. I was just looking at my spreadsheet from the last prep. At 8 weeks out, I was 260 something at 50 millimeters on the skin folds. So 30 millimeters is around where I competed at and where about most pros would be. So basically, no body fat at that point. So
Negative body fat, bro.
yeah, so it's, in the low 260s. I'm currently in the 290s at 50 millimeters.
Okay.
I'm 30 weeks out and I'm 30 pounds heavier at the
Mm.
same body fat than I was before. So we still have another, 10, 15 weeks of off season. So I'm just starting to push the calories up now. And, expect I'll probably put on another 10 pounds or so, probably be, you know, 300, 305, something like that, at the same body fat that I was at 260 to
Damn,
start.
bro.
So it's exciting times.
I'm excited. I'm excited to see where we take it. And I also think that it's going to be interesting to see kind of how this time around is different from just like a sort of you paying attention to all those sorts of signs, leading up as things start to become more stressful and greater magnitudes. I think that, not that you don't know this, but something that is going to just become increasingly more important is just that ability to, pull things back when you kind of sense that things are maybe moving too quickly or, sort of feel similar to maybe things that you've experienced in the past. But it seems like it's a really good, it's a really exciting setup. And yeah, it feels like it's far away, but also not. I think these things creep up quickly.
Right.
30 weeks is a pretty short time in the grand scheme. So yeah, the podcast people will be up to date. So, maybe not week of or week before, but it'll be interesting also to see kind of like where we take things with the podcast during those highly stressful, fatiguing times.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
can plan for a few off weeks.
I think it kind of becomes shorter and shorter to a degree because just like the more muscle you put on, the leaner you tend to stay year round.
Yeah.
So you're within much closer striking distance. And then also like the leaner, the leaner you start, potentially the shorter the prep needs to be, the more muscle you have, the more calories you eat during prep. So I don't think once you get down to those competition level body fats, it's inevitable,
Yeah.
it's going to be pretty uncomfortable. But I think the window of time in which you're feeling that discomfort, tends to shorten. And some of it is just, the identifying with, oh, I'm in, contest prep now and, everything's got to be perfect. And, part of maturity there is just like not spending too much time, not spending 30 weeks with the mentality of this is contest prep, nothing can go wrong. And that's like,
Yeah.
I actually started about 30 weeks out last time just because I was coming off the injury.
All right. Well, exciting times.